right there. Welcome to the program Beyond the Surface. This is where we speak with the heads of political parties that are contesting the upcoming March to regional and general elections. This is where we get a chance to get to know the person behind the political party, and also we get to hear about their plans going forward. On today's program, we'll get the opportunity to meet the presidential candidate of the Citizenship Initiative, Ms. Rondha-Ann. Good day, welcome to the program. It's our pleasure. All right, so I would like to start off by asking about Rondha-Ann. Who is Rhonda for persons? I mean, you've been about for some time in the political sphere, in a matter of weeks or so. You came to light. For persons who might still not be familiar with Rhonda, can you tell us who she is?
I think the most critical thing for persons who are asking who I am is that I'm a mom of 4, and I am a 21-year-old veteran of the classroom. I've spent more specifically the last 10 years educating students in preparations for English A, English B, and then within the last 5 years for communication studies and literatures in English at the CAPE exams. So if I were to ask and to summarize myself in one sentence, I'm a mom and I'm a teacher.
In our pre-interview, you did say that you set out initially to become a lawyer, and then you ended up in the classroom so many years. How did that happen?
I had a gap year. I had graduated from the Bishop's High School in 1998, and I had a law career planned out. You know, as growing up as a girl, my father used to say, "You're either going to become a politician or a lawyer." Politics wasn't, it didn't look that rosy or friendly for me. So I said, "All right, well, let's do the law." And I took a gap year because I wanted to be able to contribute not only financially to the home, but also to ease some of the burden of law school on my parents. And I ended up entering a private school that was starting that September in 1998 to be a nursery assistant. 2 days or 3 days before the school started, the principal said to me, she says, "I'm short a teacher, but you are qualified to be able to carry this class." And she assigned me to what we call a grade 2. At that time, it was a prep B class. And so I was now responsible for 23 6-year-olds. And so the first month in, I turned to her and I said, "This is fun, I'm interested in this." And she says, "Don't worry, I have somebody coming." And I said, "Okay." And we kept going, and I think it was the October of 98 when she turned to me and she said, "The lady is, she can start." And I said, "No, it's okay." And so I ended up in that year, and within the space of that year is when I just reordered this entire plan I had. And there I was, law school out the door. And my focus was purely on education at that point.
Did Dad get to see you become a politician?
No, he did not. He died in 2006.
Oh, didn't see that one coming. All right. So let's talk about how you get involved in politics itself. What were you doing? Walk us through that moment.
I'm very opinionated, but I've learned over the years to temper my opinions with, reading up on concepts, and then social media has a way of persons, because they have access to the internet, they fire off certain statements. And I found myself, they would say certain things and I'd be like, "That's not what the law says. That's not what the Constitution says." So I started paying a little more attention to, not only necessarily to refute people's points, but to ensure that I stayed abreast and, I was able to offer critical insights. And I think that's the educator in me at some points. But what was more specific was I was very vocal about the state of education in Guyana. And when the idea for TCI was being formed, and I was invited to be a part of it, it was, we'd like to have a teacher crafting education policy for us. And so I came equipped, these were the things I wanted to change, these were the things I lobby for, those kinds of things. And so ultimately, that's how that conversation happened. But to add to that political discourse, when you teach literatures, anything related to literatures in English or even English B, literary thought and political thought crisscross at major points. So it was something I'd also have to keep abreast of in terms of being able to explain to the students the differences, because sometimes you find writers have undertones of politics. And so you have to be able to explain that contextually for students. So there's always been that background floating around going there. And so ultimately, that's how I got into this. If someone had said to me 18 months ago, I'd be sitting here discussing why I'm the presidential candidate for TCI, I'd have probably laughed and said, not quite.
You could have joined forces with the People's Progressive Party
Yes.
Civic, the a Partnership for National Unity AFC, but you choose TCI.
I like the idea of grassroots movements. And not only grassroots movements, but grassroots movements dictated by the citizenry. What we've found is over the years, those larger political parties, the term we use in TCI is the Leviathans. They have established norms and practices which I couldn't see myself subscribing to, especially given our political system of being loyal to a list. My mouth would not have allowed me to, to just be quiet. And
Is that the only thing?
that's the only thing I'll say publicly. But we like the idea of pushing for that citizenry change, and I like the idea of doing it from the ground, brand new, building from scratch, and ensuring that what we stand for, what our constitution, well, TCI's constitution, of course, says, is citizenry participation. And so those are two main factors, I think, for me in terms of that I couldn't see myself joining. There were concepts within those two parties that I couldn't see myself aligning and more than likely staying quiet about.
But you voted for one or the other in the past?
I have switched. I am one of those voters who wear manifestos sway me. And your track record and, how well you've kept to the things you've said within that.
There was something from those political parties at those specific times that spoke to you.
And when I first voted as a 19-year-old, we were at that dawn of democracy call, that massive switch. And ironically, my parents were actually supporters separately. My mom supported one party, my father supported the other.
But everybody got along in the home.
Oh, no, yes, absolutely. I don't remember battles. Like, my father would say something, and my mother would go like, that does not making any sense, right? And she'd outline this list of things that not making sense. And then he turned to her and he said, well, you have this, and this is not making sense. But then what I discovered with them was them saying to me repeatedly, you have to make the decisions. Oh. And so the idea of manifesto was drilled into me from a little girl.
So there was no pressure to listen.
No.
We're supporting this party, we're trying to win her over here, or this is how our house would vote, and you need to. That was not the case.
When I went, when I would have had conversations with other friends, and they would say things to me like that, I'd be like, what are you people talking about?
Yes, that's a norm, actually.
So, and I think they were looking at me like I was growing a few heads.
Correct.
But I've never been pressured. Even as recently as the last election.
There was democracy in your house.
Oh, yes. My mother would say to me, one day, I remember one year saying to her, I am totally lost. I do not know where to put this X. What do you think? And I remember her turning to me, she looked across and she says, you know fully well what you have to do. But ironically as well, all of the manifestos ended up in our house. Like my father would read the opposite side, my mother would read the opposite side. Wow. So that kind of thing was inculcated from me for long. And my mother, ironically, the same kind of mouth I have, she also had. So looking back, it was strange now thinking that this was a woman who also allowed me the ability to think independently and to form my own decisions. And I'm pretty sure we voted over the years. Who I voted for, she didn't vote for. But never a battle. Never a conversation about, oh, you this or you're that. So when I entered politics and to listen and I read some of the comments, I am disheartened by it. We've lost that respect for the other person's right to vote for whomever. You can have an opinion on it, but you don't need to tear the other person down for it. So, and those are the kinds of things I'm raising my children for. They make certain comments and I'm like, but that's not how we do it. This is how it's done. And so that voter education is also critical for me.
We're going to get back to that point in just a second because it's a very important point you raised there. But I want to ask, given that we're on you and the party, talk to us about how it is that you became the presidential candidate of the party. Was there a vote? Was there, you push your hand in the bag and you pull out a name? How did it go?
When we launched in October, one of the first things we said was that a natural leader would emerge and we would look for the best presidential candidate. So I was there with my little list, I'm looking at everyone and I'm jotting down my pros and cons because we knew the meeting was coming for us. So eventually you'd have to make that decision. And so we got to that and they said, all right, let's go. And my name went up. I was nominated and we waited for a second. And I was like, man, look, y'all, this is not going to happen. And then we had a second and a third and a fourth. And then somebody said, can we just close it now and be done with it? And I was like, no, we have to vote, And I'm looking around at these faces and they're smiling at me. I tell people, I said, even I wasn't prepared for that day. So that name went up and the entire body agreed to it. And I think it was the first time in my life I was ever shocked. So that's how I ended up being, it was a nomination and then there were no abstentions, there were no deferrals. It was just all yays.
Your party recently made a decision to release its financing, some details on that, and the breakdown of spending and so forth. That is a first in some sense. Why did the party move along that line?
The current requirements for financial reporting in terms is within 35 days of any election in Guyana, each party is supposed to submit a list of expenses to GCOM. In all of the history that we've managed to look at, data available, we've never seen or we've never heard of it happening. But one of the things we've learned over the years is that corruption starts on the campaign trail. Persons donate large sums of money, and then once you get into power, you get into positions of power. They're going to come asking for favors. And so it was critical for us to be transparent and to be accountable to the population. And we wanted to start from the get-go. Now, campaign finance reform is another area that we're campaigning on heavily. This idea of being accountable, being transparent with the people's money. And since it was actually ordinary Guyanese people who've donated to us, both local and overseas, we felt it was critical that we also account for their contributions in that sense. And so in that radical transparency that we were pushing for, that was why we committed to a preliminary release of data 3 weeks before the elections, which we released. And then, of course, we will fulfill all the requirements per the law and complete that process within 35 days of the election of all of our income and our expenditure as well.
And talk to us about your campaigning methodology, because I think it is also an unconventional one, the way you go about, the way you meet the people at the grassroots and so forth. It is not like what we see taking place. Talk to us about that.
Small parties don't have, I shouldn't say small parties. The other small parties will be, they say new parties. They don't have the financial, run-of-the-mill backing that the larger ones do. So what is critical is that you utilize and you spend those kinds of dollars wisely. And so social media has played an integral part, our ability to boost ads, for instance. But I like the idea of grassroots. So I've spent months in the field. When we were building policy, we went to villages. We spoke to persons. We developed relationships with them. We said, this is what we're thinking. Is it going to work?
And I want to jump in here.
Sure.
What was the most memorable experience you and the party would have had so far going down to the grassroots level, meeting with folks?
I went up to Chesney a few weeks, not even a few weeks ago, about 2 weekends ago. And I walked we were going house to house. Who was home, we would chat with them. If they weren't home, we left literature for them. And I walked into a yard to chat with a gentleman. And he turned to me and he said, no, this was an older gentleman. This is not a gentleman we were necessarily courting, in the TCI's voter potential block. And he turned to me and he said, oh, it's you. And I said, what do you mean? He says, this is you. And he turned and he showed me a picture. And I said, yes, that's me. He's like, wow. And it was an interview I did early December. And he says, I never thought I'd meet you. So he was an older voter. And like I said, it wasn't someone I'd even remotely have considered. So it is, for me, those were the memorable voters, the voters that we weren't necessarily thinking would be a TCI voter, but there he was. And he says to me, he's like, I can't believe I've met you. And he did, we discussed, I spent a good 10 minutes chatting with him. And for me, that was memorable.
If the election results do happen to fall below your expectations, this is part of life. These are things that we can't discount. Do you plan to go back to people like him and others?
Yes. We have what we call a 5-year plan. There's a now plan, and then there's a 5-year plan, because change doesn't happen within a few months of you wanting it. I might not even be around to see this massive change that I want to see for Guyana. But ultimately, I said to him, you're going to see me afterwards. And he says, that's good. I was talking to Tushao from Region 9 recently, and he says, when you're ready, you know where to find me. And I said, yes, I just need to work up the dollars to get into you. We went to Lake Kapui. They also were looking at a plan, that we can assist with them. So even if it doesn't work in our favor, within our next year, another 5 years, you have LGs coming up and those kinds of things, 2 rounds of them. You still have to work. You still have to do the work. But because we're pushing for this massive change, you have to be able to keep being accountable to the grassroots, those people who would have voted for you, and you didn't just court them for a vote. So that gentleman, he and I have a date. That's the term we used, So we're going to have that date in a few, just after the elections.
All right. When we come back, we are going to talk about the pillars on which the party functions, and we are going to also talk about those regions in which TCI is contesting, and a whole lot more. We'll take a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back, and you're looking at Beyond the Surface. And on today's program, we're speaking with the presidential candidate of the Citizenship Initiative, Rondha-Ann. We would like to pick this conversation up back on the 6 pillars of the party. Talk to us about those.
What we did when we formed TCI, we said these were ideally the areas we wanted to focus on. And so what we did was we drafted, some ideas that we spent close to about 3 to 4 months in the field, long even before we launched, having conversations with citizens. We're saying, listen, we're thinking about this, we're thinking about that. Tell us how it will work. And what we wanted to do was to create a manifesto or a development plan that catered for different areas, instead of this broad-based approach, where what would work in Region 10 couldn't possibly work in 4. So that's what we did. And so the first one, for instance, is enhanced citizenry participation. And that takes into consideration things like constitutional reform, marijuana decriminalization, and the repeal of the Criminal Libel Act. And then, of course, that also takes into consideration within constitutional reform bicameral legislation. We want to move Parliament back to 2 houses, where you have the upper house, which is ultimately, you have your sitting ministers and things like that. But then that second house is the one where we have the constituencies represented. So, for instance, in the current arrangement we have, it's 40 top-up seats and 25 geographic seats. In the one we propose, we'd flip it. It will be 15 top-up and 50 geographic. So it means, therefore, that the representatives from Berbice, the representatives from Mahdia, from Linden, they're all persons who live there, and they would have had to participate in an election to get to Parliament.
So you'll have more grassroots participation
Exactly.
At that high level.
It also allows for independent persons to join and be a part of that legislative body. So ultimately, in the end, we want to move the representation of the people back to the people. For instance, the no confidence motion was something that showed us, when Charandas Prasad said, I had a conscience vote, he didn't vote along with the party line. And that list system ensures that your loyalty lies to a party or lays with a party. So ultimately, the conscience vote that he said he had made people wonder, Was it truly a conscience vote? We want to remove that. We want people to see that their politicians will truly represent them. And it's also a more accountable system. They know exactly who's representing them, and they know exactly who to, put that fire under in terms of that. So that's really where we're pushing for in terms of that change. That change lies with the people, and we remove them from that ballot box voting of responsibility. The democracy is all year round, rather than every 5 years.
All right, I want to turn to the decriminalization of marijuana.
Yes.
As stated on your website, the continued criminalization of cannabis is an idea that is outdated and discriminatory and illogical. There is no excuse for its continuation, which is why in your first year in the National Assembly, you are proposing to decriminalize marijuana. You're saying that this is non-negotiable. So your position on that is clear.
Yes.
Marijuana criminalization disappropriately criminalizes poor people and young people and opens them to exploitation. My question is, how so? Because this is coming from you also. And what does the party plan on doing with regards to decriminalizing marijuana?
It's a twofold process for us. One is, the other one has to do with the economics of it. Correct. In that sense, we'd like to utilize the lands we have in Guyana to plant hemp. Hemp, because it forms part of the cannabis family, is naturally going to be illegal. So whilst we have the social aspect of it, in the sense that you have predominantly young people going to jail for small quantities of marijuana and spending 3 years, and then when they come out, they have a record. Jobs are going to be difficult because, you can't get a police clearance, and a lot of people are now insisting on that. Plus, when young people, we shouldn't have them in jail. They should be in school. So, and then, of course, there's also the aspect of the Rastafarian community. That is an essential part of it. In fact, we've likened it to getting Holy Communion as part of, being Anglican or being Catholic. So you're also marginalizing a part of the citizenry of Guyana. So it's a multifaceted approach. We want to be able to plant hemp to ensure that we're able to utilize those lands in order to ensure that our citizenry have economic diversification in that sense. And then we want to ensure that marginalized communities in that sense. And by that I mean, for instance, the Rastafarian community, are predominantly young people going to prison for small amounts of marijuana, don't hamper their futures. So it is not just a one-off thing. It is multifaceted in that sense. It takes into consideration a number of areas. And we're not the only party talking about this as well. So clearly, and what we've seen across the world, for instance, Trinidad in December just recently legalized up to a certain amount. I believe it was St. Lucia and Jamaica also have aspects of it. For instance, last year, Colorado earned $873 million from...
By the way, this information was taken from where?
That is actually on a website recently from the Colorado, I think it's colorado.gov. But I can verify that. But the figure is there. In fact, quite recently as well, I saw a university, not remembering the name exactly right now, they're actually going to offer degrees in it. So we are miles behind. And we're not only talking first world countries, we're talking sister territories. Trinidad more recently in that sense. So there's a lot of catch up. So for us, it's an economic process, as well as to just ensure that sections of the population aren't necessarily their futures aren't restricted. And then, of course, with the Rastafarian community, it is an integral part of their belief system, and you have to be mindful and respectful of that as well.
All right, I want to turn to economics. Yes. This is one of the pillars of the party also, to look at economic security, diversification, and growth. What exactly is your economic philosophy in TCI?
We have, like I told you just now, the aspect of crop diversification, but so hemp plays a massive role in that. We are also pushing for what is called the orange economy, meaning it's not the area where we traditionally earn money from. So, for instance, with the idea of ensuring that arts and culture play an integral part of it. For instance, intellectual property laws have to be revisited in that sense, and we'd be able to earn money from that. We want to push for a creative arts institute, which would ensure that persons who, they're able to make movies, they're able to do things that have to do with the internet, but their property rights are protected. In Britain, for instance, just let's look at the example of the Harry Potter books. That has actively earned more dollars. I'm forgetting the exact figure. But just that series of Harry Potter books has contributed massively towards not only with books, but also with movies and spin-offs and things like that. So we have to get creative and move. Yes, agriculture is important. Yes, mining. Yes, oil is also going to be important. But we want to be able for people to be able to earn. Poets, musicians, dramatists, playwrights, all of those people also have active roles to play.
All right, I want to jump in here because we've got to wrap things up. Two quick questions. The first being, you did not decide to join your lists with any of the other newer political parties, even though you were approached. You were even in discussion with a Change Guyana, and a decision was made not to. Why was that? So even though the newer parties feel that you have a greater possibility of earning a seat at the table, why did you not?
For a lot of it was time. For instance, we were planning for a nomination day that was the end of January. And GCOM, of course, logistics-wise and all of those, they had to move it up. So what it meant was it was a crunch time in that sense. So when we approached certain parties, and for us to that release of the finances was a critical bargaining thing for us. Because for us, how would it look if we want to release and our partner? No, I'm not saying they did or they won't. I'm just saying that was critical for us. So there were some principles that we went to the bargaining table with, and it was never about who was going to be the presidential candidate.
But what about Change Guyana? You did say, you talked about the optics.
Yes.
At Duke Lodge.
We have to be mindful of the fact that Guyana is multi-ethnic, and if we're talking about inclusion, in fact, the metrics have to be mindful of not only, and since TCI is very much pushing for gender equality and youth equality, what you'd have is two older politicians again, in that sense, and then, of course, the two at the top slate weren't necessarily always going to match the kind of mixture that the Guyanese people have come to expect. And we're not talking just one person is one ethnicity and one person is the other as tokenism. We're just talking about, so there were a number of factors in that sense. But ultimately, at the end of the day, everything boiled down to time. Even with the joining of the lists, we had nomination day and we had a week later to literally work our way towards. And so by the time the discussions got in of what everybody would want, and because our constitution says, it is maximum rules, so when they voted, whilst yes, we did have some persons who would have voted for the joining of the list, they were overwhelmingly not in favor of it.
Could we see such happening in the future for the next elections?
No, absolutely. Coalitions are not off the list. The coalitions, it's the larger two parties. We've said that point blank. We're never going to coalesce with them. But, in Parliament, that's a different ballgame. You can't coalesce after an election.
Correct.
But we can certainly bargain for things we want. You want to pass the budget? Then let's talk constitutional reform. Let's talk campaign finance reform. Let's talk the things we want to have happen. So ultimately, in the end, the future, I don't know what the future brings, but for the larger two parties, no.
All right, finally, I want to end on the note asking about Melissa Atwell. She is in the leadership, she's among the leadership of the party in that? She's not.
Candidate.
She's just a candidate.
Correct.
However, she would have made appearances
Yes.
on behalf of the party in at certain places
Yes.
and so forth. Once she faced a lawsuit in the past.
Criminal libel, yes.
Correct. And then just recently, she was called out for making certain posts rather, about the coronavirus, which according to the Ministry of Public Health were not so based on what she posted. What are your thoughts on someone who is representing the party, who is appearing alongside the leadership rather of the party, and then is coming under such a scrutiny?
Ultimately, at the end of the day, even I would have come on. I have come under scrutiny. So I can't, and this is where we walk that thin line of freedom of speech versus responsibility that comes with it. For us, I've said to candidates, there are codes of conducts that every single candidate has signed on to, and we've had to ensure that they followed it.
Has she breached any?
Not that I'm aware of in that sense. I've not seen anything hostile or inflammatory from her, and no one has brought that to my attention. They've brought the coronavirus one.
And your
and
thoughts?
we have spoken to her about it, in the sense of because Melissa has been a social activist long before TCI was a part of it.
Correct.
And she has a style and a manner in which she ensures that, she gets her details out. So given the fact of the previous lawsuit and then, of course, this one, we've cautioned her in that sense about when she's making certain postings, they have to come with disclaimers. She has to verify on those kinds of things. So I think moving forward, Melissa is quite aware of what, her responsibilities are. We've spoken with her about it. And so what you will see and, what is expected of any person contesting for candidacy is a responsibility that comes with that. Now, I've also learned that humans are, but humans are fallible. And so in the heat and the rush of the moment, and what I know is that multiple persons would have made certain statements to her. And so she took that as verification and she ran with that. But ultimately, in the end, we're humans. We make mistakes and we have to be able to, and if we're given the opportunity to correct it and we do so, then absolutely.
In wrapping up finally,
Yes.
I know I did say finally before, talk to us about the regions in which you're contesting in.
We're contesting regions 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 10. The game plan for the other 4 regions we couldn't financially afford it. And so they're on the LGs coming up. We're going to push for them. And then finally in 2025, we're going to be a 10 region strong party. Fielding candidates as well. Mind you as well, we also had candidates sitting waiting for the other regions as well. So it wasn't a candidate issue for them. It was just ensuring that we'd be able to mobilize and not just show up and ask people for a vote just because. We want to build relationships with those regions before we say, yes, we want to represent.
In
you.
those regions you're voting,
Yes.
you're contesting in, are you there at the regional and the general?
No. The regional elections called for quite a large number of candidates. And so we opted this year not to go for regional elections. But we have LGs coming up and we're going to push for the constituencies and then LGs again. And then, so by 2025, we would have mobilized enough to not only be able to contest national elections, but also regional elections all at the same time. Once there's no massive, we're expecting massive constitutional change. So.
I am sorry, but we're out of time. And I'm trusting that I get the opportunity to sit and talk with you again in the near future because there's so much more that we can talk about, you would agree. Today we were chatting with the presidential candidate of the Citizenship Initiative Party, Ms. Rondha-Ann. Thank you once again for being here with us. Until next time, goodbye.